Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Ben Rhodes. I'm the Senior Vice President with CAMS. Thank you for joining us tonight. We do have Chris Gelwicks with us again, talking about bad behavior in community associations. So always a fun topic, and I had a phone call today with a board member about something very similar. So as a reminder, we do record the sessions, and we do encourage you to share this information with your board members. You can find these recordings at camsmgt.com under the board members section. Follow the webinars link, and we have a lot of great webinars for y'all to view. So if you want to view anything else, they are all there for your viewing pleasure. We will be taking questions at the end of the session, so feel free to type in some questions and we'll try and get those answered. We're going to try and end about 5:20 tonight, so we can have a little time for Q&A. I have another meeting tonight and Chris has to get on the road to Columbia, so we do encourage you to ask those questions, and we'll try and talk fast through the entire presentation. So Chris, I will turn it over to you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you share yours. So
wonderful. Oh, well, thanks, Ben. Hi, everybody. Again, this is Chris Gelwicks with the McIntosh Law Firm in Davidson, North Carolina. I am licensed in both North and South Carolina, and pretty much all I do is HOA work. So let me share my screen here, and we will get started. In preparation for this, folks, this topic is huge because just about everything that we do, it can be a headache. What we're dealing with is everything from bad behavior to just unfortunate circumstances to board behavior, things like that. So the goal, folks, is I can't touch on everything. It's not possible. So in dealing with this, I'm just going to go through a couple of things because, of course, when you all signed up for this and you're volunteered to be a board member, I'm sure you never thought there'd be any headaches. But I've divided the potential issues really into 4 categories. A violations headache. Somebody is violating something in the restrictions and the rules, and what you can do for those. Then you got the non-violation headache. And I'll explain that as we get into it. Then we have the documents are not clear headache. And then we have, is it an HOA issue headache? Each one of these requires the board, in my opinion, to take on a different role. And those roles could be the policeman, the politician, the lawyer, the mediator. So, that's what we're going to touch on. We're going to move fast. We're going to take a high level view, give you some basics, and hopefully answer some questions at the end. So in looking at all of this, the first thing we have to understand, and this applies both to North and South Carolina, there's nothing here. There's one little distinction towards the end that we'll get to, but there's nothing here that doesn't apply to both. Your roles, generally to govern the community. And in governing community, what are the main roles? You got to collect your assessments, you got to form committees. Your goal is to act for the common welfare of the community. And one of those main rules, of course, is to enforce your restrictions to the extent you can, as allowed for in the governing documents, and to adopt rules and enforce those. Those are the main roles as a director. All of that involves a fiduciary duty to do things that act for the general common welfare for the benefit of the community. All right. So what are we talking about? And yes, I pulled out the T.J. Hooker, William Shatner, Heather Locklear, and the other 2 guys picture because I just grew up in that time frame. But when I think of policemen, that's what I think of. So when you're dealing with violations, they can obviously be, I hope everyone understands, they can be the restrictions of the rules that you have, of your architectural guidelines or other guidelines, depending upon what you have. We come right to the question of, can we govern behavior that's on lots? And you can always govern behavior that's on common area. You have the right to make rules and over what common area is controlled by the association, whatever that is, pool, clubhouse, playground, etc. But what about if it goes, what if the violation occurs on a lot? Well, you want to see if there's a restriction that addresses it. Parking is a prime example. parking on a driveway, if you have language in your restrictions that says you must park on your driveway, and someone parks on their lawn, all right, well, that's a restriction. If it's a restriction, you can enforce it. And you have the power to adopt rules and regulations over what occurs on the lot or unit if you're allowed to do that in your restrictions. And here's what I mean by that. I would want to see in your restrictions some language that allows the association to adopt rules and regulations that govern what happens on a lot. Now, we're not talking about restrictions. Restrictions on a lot, we just said parking. It could deal with pets. It could be all kinds of things. And a prime example I like to use is you have a restriction, a recorded restriction in your covenants that says no clotheslines allowed. That's easy to enforce. Somebody puts a clothesline up, it's in your restrictions, we point to it, and you can take your remedial action. But what if something happens that's not on a lot that is not listed in the restrictions? Can you adopt rules and regulations over what occurs on the lot? The answer to that is if it's in your documents that allows you, gives the board the power to adopt rules and regulations over lots, then you may do it. You have to follow the procedure when you enforce. And you must, in doing that, the goal is to get compliance. Now, what do we mean by enforcement? Someone is violating the restrictions, somebody is violating the rule, whether it's on common area or on lot. North Carolina statute is pretty clear. You have the right to levy a fine after or notice in hearing or suspend privileges or both. In South Carolina, there is no law that discusses that anywhere. You have the right in South Carolina to adopt rules and regulations, and you must record those. I hope everyone understands that. And of course, you have the restrictions in your documents. If there is a fine procedure, a fine, suspension of privileges, and a hearing procedure in your documents in South Carolina, you may use that procedure to fine somebody or take remedial action, etc. If your documents are silent in South Carolina, if you have no right listed in your restrictions to levy a fine or suspend privileges in response to violations to the restrictions or rules, then you may not do it. You must sue the owner in court, seek injunctive relief, damages, whatever, to get compliance. Just be aware of that. There's no law in South Carolina that allows for that. North Carolina has a law that does. One thing in dealing with enforcing restrictions to ease your headaches is you should act quickly. If something is occurring, I give a prime example. If someone is putting up a fence and they didn't get architectural approval, you see it, you should take what remedial action you can take as soon as possible. The longer you wait, the more likely that you could have a problem in enforcement down the road. And I'm going to address a specific case that I dealt with a little later in this that deals with timing. So we're going to get to the first poll question here. I'm going to post this for you now and launch it. And the poll question is, have you received complaints from owners on issues that are not addressed in the restrictions or association rules? Yes or no? I'll give everybody a chance to answer that. And at the moment, we are at 45, 50, coming up on over 60 answers, an overwhelming majority, about 77%, 76 responses, and 77% of them, 59, said yes, you've received complaints on issues not addressed in the restrictions or the association's rules. For those 18 or 23% that have not received such questions, good for you. And I hope at some point, well, I hope you never have to, but you probably will. So we're going to move on to that issue on the slide, the non-violation headache. So what do we talk about a non-violation headache? Prime example is noise. Now, if you have a restriction, or this is if you have no restriction or rule that talks about noise, you get a call from a homeowner. My neighbor's dog is barking at all hours of the night. It's waking me up. And you don't have a restriction or a rule. Anybody ever get that one? I'm sure you have. Parking on the street or in the wrong location. Now, when I say wrong location or parking on the street, again, when there's no restriction or rule that addresses it. Someone's parking right in front of somebody else's house and they don't like it. Exterior lights. This is a new one. Exterior lights from the neighbor's property shining in my window in the middle of the night and waking me up. Or dogs using the bathroom on a lot and not cleaning it up. No, the owner's not cleaning it up when there's no restriction addressing that. Now, keep in mind, that's on a lot. Again, the association can always make a rule governing common area that requires owners to pick up after their dogs. Of course, then the issue is how you're going to enforce it, but different issue. There's items that are additions. This is a hot one too. Somebody changed something on the exterior of their property, did not seek architectural approval, and it's been there 5 years and the prior board didn't address it. Maybe it's been there 10 years. That's a non-violation headache because of the passage of time. I'm going to tell you that. You're not going to be able to enforce anything there due to the passage of time in the example I gave. The list goes on. This is the bad behavior that gives everyone the most headaches because everyone is looking to the board to do something. There must be something the board can do to stop the dog from going to the bathroom on my lot. Must be. That's why we have an HOA. That's the question that everybody's asking. The answer, folks, is, well, let me do a case study on this real quick. And this is why, and then I'll get into more on what we do in those situations. This is a case study. If you look in the corner of the screen, you're going to see a picture of a dirt driveway. Now, this is not the actual driveway from the case that I've tried a jury trial on, but it is an example of what was on the property. The basics of this is a community was formed. The restrictions allowed a brick or asphalt or concrete driveway only. During construction of this one particular property, the driveway was built, the driveway itself, the main driveway was concrete or asphalt was fine. But on the side of the property, when construction vehicles were using it, ruts began to form during construction. Gravel got spilled on it at one point, so it kind of looked like a gravel driveway. The owner began to use it and to access the rear of his property. The association that I was representing at the time had, and that I still represent actually, had a strict procedure on how they deal with violations. They must be notified in writing by the complaining owner and then they will take action. They were never formally notified, though this thing is, if you drive into that neighborhood today, you can see this gravel driveway. It's there for everybody to see. Nevertheless, no one officially wrote them and said, oh, there's a gravel driveway here, the owner's using it, it's not in compliance, you got to do something. And so board after board took no action. Well, the owner wanted a letter of compliance saying that the driveway was compliant because of the passage of time. The board wouldn't, the board that I came on to represent, when I came on to represent the association, wouldn't give it to him. He brought a lawsuit. We tried the case after 2 years of discovery and depositions and all that stuff. The jury decided that the driveway, yeah, is in violation, but that the board waited too long to enforce it. So what's the headache? Well, because this is a done deal, right? Well, to this day, owners that buy into that community complain to the board that there is this gravel driveway eyesore in the middle of this $1 million home community, and there's no resolution, there's nothing's happening, we got to do something. I'll even tell you this. One of the witnesses in our case who actually testified for the association complains to the board to this day about that driveway, even though he lived across from that driveway for years and years and years and didn't say anything, didn't put it in writing. So the headache here is what I referred to in the prior slide. Prior boards took no action, and now it's too late. That's probably one of the biggest headaches, and not a lot of people think of that, but that's probably one of the biggest headaches that you see is everything from prior boards approving something that shouldn't have been approved architecturally to violation occurring and nothing being done for years and years and years. So how do we deal with this with our membership? And this is not really legal stuff. This is more practical stuff. But communicate with your owner, complaining owner, why you can't do anything. You can explain in detail as much, as unless there's privileged information, you can explain, look, too much time's passed, we can't. Or I don't have the authority as a board to take remedial action for a dog going to the bathroom on your lot because there's nothing in the restrictions or rules that allow us to do that. You can also tell the owner that's complaining, give them alternatives. Owners, every member has the right to bring an action against another owner to enforce the covenants. When you tell an owner that, of course, you also have to tell them that they have to foot that bill, and most of them will then go away. But you can also describe the practical issues involving enforcement. Let's take the dog example, the dog going to the bathroom and the owner not picking it up. You may have a rule on that, but who is going to constantly monitor who's on what lawn at what time? Are the owners? Let's say it's happening in the middle of the day when people are at work. Who's going to sit there and monitor? Who's going to take the picture? And the person doing it might not even be an owner in the community. So there's all these questions, which there's all these issues that will make it tougher to enforce. If you even have a rule, and if you don't have a rule or restriction, you don't have the power. And unfortunately, nowadays, and I blame some of this on COVID, when everybody was sitting at home for months at a time, looking around their community, and saying, "Oh, I all of a sudden don't like something." People are rarely content with being told, "Hey, we can't do anything about it." And we'll talk about how to deal with that owner here in a little bit. But whatever you tell them, they're likely going to be discontented. They're probably going to be less than happy with that answer. And you're going to have to live with it because that comes with the job. But the key here is you've explained the situation to the owner. You've told them what the issues are, and you've given the owner an alternative, perhaps, in dealing with the offending owner or the offending person. Next poll question. And let me move to poll question 2 here. And I'm launching that now. I'll read it. Have you pursued the fine suspension process on issues that are not completely clear in the restrictions in the past? This one's a more sketchy one, and we're going to talk about what I have put together on this here shortly. We're coming up into the 60 response range so far. And it looks like about 70% no and about 31% yes. So the no is, have you pursued the fine suspension process on issues that are not completely clear in the restrictions? 71% have said no. It's an interesting response, and probably about what I expected. So we're going to talk about that next. So the docs are not clear headache, and this is where you got to play the lawyer. When you were, as I said, when the violation section, when it's clear, you're the policeman. When they're not clear, you're a politician because you're trying to make people understand. You're trying to win them over, but there's not a lot you can do. That's kind of a real good definition of politician at times. But in this case, now they've got the docs are not clear. It's vague. The prime example that I can give is the nuisance section of everybody's declaration. Everybody talks about somebody being a nuisance. It's not clear. Somebody's letting a swamp grow on their property, or somebody is revving their car all hours of the night. You know that, and that's a nuisance. Well, maybe. And the question becomes: is the issue if it's unclear in your documents, if it's not clear one way or the other? What are your options? Somebody is doing something it's close call either way. You got 3 choices, in my opinion. One, you can be bold. You can begin the violation process and continue it all the way through. And in that, that's one where you need to be ready for it. You need to have a united front. This is a violation, and we're going to stick to it. Second option is to bluff. Start the violation process, take it to a point and see if they comply. And at some point you understand, you make the decision, we're going to stop. And 3, your third option is to let it be. The issue is not worth the trouble, or it's just, it's completely unenforceable. We're not going to win that fight, so we're not going to bother. In making the decision on how to proceed on those, you really have to decide how important the issue is. And in that, one of the questions you have to ask is, what do we know about the owner? Is the owner that is allegedly in violation or is causing a headache, are they litigious? Are they combative? Is this a one-time problem, or is this a continuous problem? Usually if it's a headache, it's a continuous problem, or it's maybe not, maybe this owner has had other issues in the past and now something new is coming. So that's a consideration. If someone is litigious, meaning that they're going to sue at the drop of the hat, you need to be very careful about being bold and bluffing. You better make sure you're right. If they are not litigious, if this is a rare thing, it hasn't happened before, and it's important, then yeah, maybe it is a decision where you continue with the fine and violation process and see if you can get compliance, because that's the goal, is to get compliance. And then the next question, that is, will they comply? If you believe this is enough to push to potentially a litigation end, will you be able to convince the owner to comply? Will the potential action that you're going to take get compliance on their end? And the next one is, do we need to make a statement? Is this issue big enough in the association, big enough to the members, that we're going to die on that hill? I will tell you, in an HOA, there are not a lot of issues that you want to die on the hill by going to court, but there are some. It could be everything from an architectural issue, an interpretation of some language in that, to something very clear like no parking on the street, and someone continues to do it. Well, you get into the debate of whether the streets are private or public, and that's a whole nother seminar. But those are issues that you will have to evaluate. You will have to evaluate on a case-by-case basis. And remember, the goal is not revenge. It's not to penalize. It's not to get fines and collect them so that you can fill the association coffers. It's to get compliance if at all possible. And whatever you do, whoever your HOA attorney is, you should not make these decisions on a closed call without consulting the attorney and getting their opinion. And I will tell you, there are of the attorneys in the North and South Carolina that do what I do, you may get 2 or 3 different opinions depending upon the facts and the language. But that's why you rely on the attorney you have. And if you don't like it, you can certainly get a second opinion. But the one thing about it is, if you are going to make a bold move, or if you're going to bluff to a point, even if you are following an attorney's recommendation, or even if the attorney is not necessarily recommending that action, but tells you, yeah, it's possible, and you decide to go with it, if you rely on that, you are protected. You are fulfilling your fiduciary duty, and you're protected from getting potentially personally sued in the event of litigation that arises in these things. So the doctrine not clear headache is probably one of the more, I guess the ones you really got to think about even more, is how far you want to push it. And then what we're going to talk about now is the neighbor to neighbor dispute. Is it an HOA issue headache? And this is where I'm going to talk about being a mediator. And I don't think the association should be taking the role of mediator, but there may be times you have to. But neighbor to neighbor disputes are not HOA business. They're similar to non-violations. The owner that comes to you and says, my neighbor's dog is going to the bathroom on my yard, and the owner's not picking up, and there's no rule. That's no rule saying you have to pick it up. That's a neighbor to neighbor dispute. You kindly tell that owner, we can't get involved. You need to try to work this out with your neighbor. The exception to these types of things is where there is an allegation from one owner to another about another regarding discrimination matters. The Fair Housing Act requires the association, if it is made aware of possible discrimination occurring in a community between owners, requires the association to take certain action. That in itself is another seminar. But usually that action is at a minimum sending correspondence to the offending owner, and it may involve even an additional role of mediator. And if it's an FHA issue, the board may have to get involved, as I said. If it's an owner issue, the association just needs to say, well, this is not our issue. You guys need to work it out. It could be anything from, as I said, dog issues. It could be drainage from one yard to another, if there's no, again, this is where there's no restrictions on that or rules on that. It could even be, I'll use the prime example of the Andy Griffith episode where somebody built a fence on the fence line, cutting off the sun to the neighbor's chickens, and they went in and Barney couldn't settle the dispute. That is not something necessarily that the association would need to get involved in. If they're allowed to put the fence up and they got architectural approval, and the neighbor owner doesn't like it, well, that's life. And the association, if it followed its procedures, should not be getting involved in that dispute. If the neighbor doesn't like the fence there, he certainly has the right to take action in court if he believes the owner put the fence in the wrong spot or shouldn't have been allowed to put it up at all. So again, that's just an example. We're going to go to the third poll question here. And so the question is, and I've launched that for folks, have you tried to get an amendment passed to give some teeth to restrictions based upon complaints from owners, only to see the amendment fail? I would imagine I'm going to get a lot of yeses. I'm not getting as many as I suspected. We'll give it a few more seconds here to let people respond. So it appears we have 78, 79 responses now, and it appears 68% have said no, you have not tried to get an amendment passed to give some teeth to restrictions based upon a complaint from owners and having that amendment fail. That's actually pretty good. I don't know if that means you not tried or if it's if it passed or something, but the idea here is what I'm about to discuss is how to try to get some teeth into your restrictions and deal with these things. So what are your options? You're getting these complaints from homeowners regarding enforcement of restrictions, rules, and you tell these owners it's not an HOA issue because there's nothing in the restrictions. You're going to have to go to the owner and work it out. What are your options? You can amend the declaration. In North Carolina, we know that we need at least 67% of the membership to agree. If your documents have something higher in them, you must get that percentage, and you can amend via a vote at a meeting or via a written instrument. In South Carolina, there's no statute regarding anything regarding the amendment. So it's basically you amend by however your documents allow you to amend, whatever percentage and procedure that is in there. You're going to have to, and here's the thing, this is something that should, if your members have common sense, curtail headaches regarding putting teeth into restrictions and rules, specifically restrictions. You receive 25 complaints from these owners about, let's just say, parking on the street. You propose an amendment that says, hey, no parking on the street. You must park in your driveway, something like that. And it fails. What can you then tell the owners who complain the most? Two things, at least. One, it's not important to the entire community. Or two, you, complaining owner, didn't make it important enough to your neighbors for them to vote in favor. This board did what it could. It proposed an amendment. It drafted it, sent it out to the membership, and you didn't get enough yeses. You would think that that would cause the complaining owners about these other offending owners to back up a minute. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But nevertheless, the failure of an amendment tells me as an attorney that the issue that you want to amend your restrictions about is not as important as you think it is, at least at that time. Now, you can propose it again. And if it's fairly important to the board can certainly enlist people to go walk the neighborhood and get the votes. I've discussed that before. But the idea there again is, if it's important, it becomes important to the neighborhood on two ways. If the board makes it important, or if the neighbors make it important, then it's going to pass. If it's not, it won't. So keep that in mind in dealing with the complaints. You can tell the owners, look, we tried to amend it. We couldn't get the votes. You want to try again? You're going to need to help us. You can amend the rules again, as you're allowed to in your documents. And again, if you have the ability to make rules governing lots, that's great. And you can, now, let me caution, one cautionary tale. Whatever rules you make regarding lots, if you're allowed to do that, cannot be more restrictive than what's in the restrictions. Don't make a rule. If your restrictions say you can't park, you're not allowed to park on the street between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. You can't make a rule that says you can't park on the street between 5 p.m. and 5 a.m. You can't make it more restrictive. Okay. Remember, in South Carolina as well, with the new law that passed a few years ago, if you adopt a rule or if you amend your rules, you must publish them to the community before the meeting occurs to vote amongst the board to adopt those rules, and you must record those. And they must be recorded. If you adopt them now, they must be recorded by January 10th of the following year, or they are not enforceable. What are your other options? Create committees. And before I get a lot of hands raised about no one wants to volunteer, the first thing that I suggested when I was on my board, I was on my board for 4 years. Thankfully not anymore, but one of the things that I suggested, every time an owner complained about something and there needed to be some sort of rule change or restriction change, I suggested that that owner take the lead in being a committee member to work on that change. All of a sudden, what they were complaining about was not so important most of the time because they didn't want to get involved. So create committees if you can get volunteers to help in dealing with owners and bad behavior. How to deal with other headaches regarding enforcement is to be consistent. That means reacting quickly to alleged violations. And even if it's not a violation, reacting quickly to the complaint. It may require you to communicate with the offending owner. Even if it's not enforceable, it may be advisable, depending on the situation, for the association to send correspondence to the offending owner that says, look, we've received complaints about your car being run at revved at all hours while your dog barking. There are city ordinances or county ordinances about noise. Please be aware of this, and we would ask that you cooperate and be mindful of your neighbors. That might work. It might not. There is no set way when you're dealing with an individual, there's just really no way to know how someone is going to react to something like that. Nevertheless, if you communicate clearly with the complaining owner, at least they can, at least you've tried to make them understand why you cannot enforce something, or why you can't change the covenants by yourself. You need a vote. Or in the case of, for example, the gravel driveway, hey, look, the jury said we waited too long. We can't do anything about it at this point. Or the prior board didn't take action and we can't, and it's been too long. So all of those are just examples of how to communicate. And I was in speaking with Ben Rhodes prior to this, he brought up a situation where a board member has basically gone rogue, taken information regarding email addresses, et cetera, and is sending out communication to the members. Well, that's another bad actor, bad behavior headache. How do you deal with that? That's a whole separate issue. That's not member bad behavior. That's board bad behavior. And I didn't prepare a slide on that because Ben just brought it up to me. But what I will say is this. If you have a situation where there's bad behavior creating a headache on the board by a board member, you may have a couple of options. You can call a special meeting to remove that board member. The members would need to vote to remove them. You can take other remedial. There's a way to try to curtail that type of thing at the beginning when they take office, and is to have them sign a civility type pledge or some sort of code of conduct and agree that if they're deemed to have violated, they agree to resign. There's ways to address that behavior on the front end when they take office. Once they take office as a director, hey, then you may be left to call a special meeting to see if the members will remove them. So the thing about bad behavior, and that's the last slide. Let me just sum this up before we start taking questions. The thing about bad behavior causing headaches for boards is you can't control other people. As much as the restrictions tell you what you can and can't do on your property, you can and can't do on common area, what you can and can't build on your property. If someone does not want to comply with them, or if someone wants to walk the gray area, so to speak, on what language may or may not mean, they're going to do it. And the question for the board is, how do we handle it? How do we proceed? Is it a violation? If it's a violation, then we enforce it consistently. If it's in a gray area, if it's not a violation, or if it's something that's unclear, we're going to have to be consistent on, okay, are we going to die on the hill, or are we going to bluff our way through it, or are we going to let it be? And whatever decisions you make, you're not going to make all the headaches go away. You just won't. But you can minimize their effect as you move along in your board service. And in the end, we're all trying to, I mean, I know your members are trying to have you justify the great salaries you earn as board members, but we're all trying to do what's best for the community. And that includes dealing with things that may not be black and white in the restrictions, working out the best solution, and communicating that solution to the owners and the complaining owners is something that I think will make your jobs a little bit easier as you go along. So that was a 5,000-foot view of bad behavior because we're on a limited time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. My email address is on the screen. If we don't get to all your questions, you can email CAMS. They can get them to me. My phone number's there. And I'm going to stop my share here. And there's Ben.
Hello. So, well, thank you. I know we have one hand raised. So for the individual that has two hands raised, so please type your question using the Q&A option, and we will read those questions and be able to respond to those. So if you do have your hand raised, I would ask that you type that question in the Q&A section. So first question, regularly owners do not want to share their name as the individual that is complaining, and they're very concerned about being known as that person. How do you, and what responsibility do the owners have to make it known? And what responsibility does the management company have to make it known about the person who complains about a specific issue?
Well, I think it first depends on the issue, and it depends on how far you're going to take it. If it's a violation, and it's something that no board member observed, the owner that complained is going to have to at least provide sufficient information for the board to determine that, one, a violation occurred, and two, take whatever remedial action that it can. Understand that owner, I put it like this. I understand the desire to be anonymous because you don't want to get on the neighbor's bad side. But if the neighbor is causing a problem and you're not willing to, go to court, potentially, if that thing has to happen, then that owner needs to understand that the board may not be able to do anything long term. I'll give you, let's go to the favorite topic. The dog's going to the bathroom on my lawn. I can sit there and take a picture and send it to the board. And that board I can identify there, this is the owner that lives right next to me. That may be enough evidence. That's probably enough evidence for the board to have a violation hearing and levy a fine. But if the owner who is fined fights it, the owner that complained is probably going to have to come out of the woodwork and potentially testify, supply an affidavit. So what I would say to the owner that wants to be anonymous, hey, look, we'll do what we can, but I cannot guarantee you we'll be able to take remedial action if you're not willing to step forward.
Okay, this is a good one. We have a resident who has a Trump flag hanging in his garage. Can can the association enforce something inside the space?
If it's inside the garage, it's not exterior, so we're not talking about an architectural issue, unless there is something in the restrictions that I've seen restrictions, for example, that says you can't have certain things hanging on the inside of your windows, like certain colored blinds and things like that. If that's not in your restrictions, you're probably not going to be able to do much. Additionally, I don't know if you're in North or South Carolina and what your restrictions say about political signs or flags, but that could be an issue too. North Carolina has specific statute that if you have some certain language in the restrictions, you can limit the flying of that flag potentially, if it's a political flag. Now, I don't know if that's a political flag, or it could just be a social thing. To me, it looks political, especially with the announcement yesterday. So I would say, but if it's inside the garage and he can lower the door and you don't see it, that's a tough one. That's a tough one, but I would say a court would probably lean on it's not exterior. And if it's not exterior, you can't control it.
So can the board of directors enforce developer issues like it would homeowner issues?
I might need a little more information on that. I'm not sure, because the developer issue could be something the developer did or didn't do, or something that occurred with an owner while the developer was in control and then you turned over. I'm not sure if that person could explain a little more, that'd be good.
Okay. To amend the covenants, can you word a questionnaire to say, if no response received, we will consider your response either a yes or a no?
No, you may not. A non-vote is a no. A no vote is a no. A yes is a yes. So no, you may not. That it's in North Carolina and in every restriction I've ever read, it requires the affirmative vote of a certain percentage. The affirmative vote means a yes. Anything other than a yes, a non-vote or a no vote is a no. You can't change that by putting something in a poll and saying, hey, if you don't respond, we're going to assume it's a yes. Nice try, though. I've thought of it, but no.
Okay, a homeowner was told by the builder that if he built a concrete pad next to his driveway, he could park his boat there, which is a clear violation of our covenants. But the boat is small and the property is in the back of the lot and not very apparent. Only one or two of other homeowners have complained. The old board had not taken action for 2 years. Does the new board need to enforce?
Wow. So there's a classic headache. How many times have you had that come up, Ben? That comes up 3, 4, 5, 6 times a year, especially in the summer and
basketball goals.
Oh yeah,
regularly.
So here's the first thing I would say is, does the owner have written proof that the developer told him he could do it? Because if he does, you can't enforce it. And the reason for that is because the developer, when they were in control, they can pretty much do what they want. If they make representation in writing that an owner may do something, then they can do it. And a court is going to uphold that. If it's oral, then you have a decision to make. Do you want to push it or not? What you said is it's been there for a couple of years. So it's out in the open. It is in the back of the community, but if you drive by it, I assume you can see it. It's kind of like the gravel driveway scenario I had that I went to court on and had a jury trial. We had neighbors across the street seeing it for years and never reported it formally. But I'll tell you, every one of my board members, when I was discussing the case with them, every one of them knew it was there. Every one of them had talked to the owner about it. So if you know it's there and you've known it's been there for a couple of years and the prior board didn't do anything, there's a legal concept called latches. It's akin to the concept of waiver. You see it's there, you waited too long, you waived your right to do something. In this case, if the violation is the storage of a boat, and you're not allowed to store the boats in there, you could discuss it with the owner, but I think the reality is if you tried to force him or not store the boat there at this point after a couple of years and the prior board didn't take any action, you're probably out of luck. That's just my gut. And there's case law backing up the waiver latches argument, and that basically comes down to a case-by-case basis. I think there's a lot of factors that weigh into in this situation. Everybody knows it's there, even if it's in the back of the community. You're not doing it. You haven't done anything about it yet. You probably waived your right to do anything about it now.
Okay. Next question. Violation notice sent, no response. Hearing notice sent, no response by violator or attendance. Committee assesses fines. Can the HOA collect fines for further intermittent violations in the future?
Assuming that the hearing notice was sent and then a hearing was held and then the fines were levied. If the notice of determination of violation, and that's how I put it, if the notice that went to the owner that said, you're in violation and you're going to incur fines every time we see this in the future, yes, you may. Now, it depends on the nature of the violation, because there's an argument that, for example, let's go back to the boat. Let's go back to the boat issue from the question before. I see the boat there today. We send you a violation letter, and then I hold the hearing and I fine you. And I tell you every day that I see it there, you're going to incur an additional fine of $100. I go there tomorrow and you remove the boat. There is an argument that by removing the boat, you're no longer in violation and you have, quote, cured it. If you have cured it, if it's determined to be cured, then you have to hold a new hearing every time. There's a split among us who practice in this area about whether you have to do that, whether that is a cure or not. To me, if you word your notice correctly, then I believe that even if the boat disappeared today and came back tomorrow, you would not need to hold a new hearing. You could fine that owner for it coming back tomorrow. I would say I'm in the majority, but it's not unanimous on that thought. So.
Okay, this next question involves smoking, and I think we did do a webinar on this about 2 or 3 sessions ago, so we may have a little more information. But an issue of smoking in your condo where a unit below affects the others above and the smokers around. So can the association enforce smoking in a condominium building?
Certainly in the common elements, you can. Inside a unit is going to depend upon what is in your restrictions, in my opinion. Smells, prime example of non-smoking behavior is someone's cooking, stinking up the entire building. You get that a lot in apartment complexes for sure. That in and of itself is what is it about? What do you violate? What is the violation? If it's nuisance, I wouldn't hang my hat on that. It may be a nuisance to everybody in the building, but what is a nuisance is a subjective standard. We would need something objectively to say smoking is a violation. So what I would want objectively is there is no smoking in any unit in the condominium building, period. I would want a restriction like that. And I wouldn't want it in a rule. I would want it in a restriction. And if that's not there, and you would have to amend your restrictions. I think if you amend restrictions, you could. Then the issue becomes, do we have to, quote, grandfather in the current smokers? There is no requirement at law that you grandfather in anybody. That word grandfather is not even, I can't remember the Latin term I used previously, but it's a false narrative. It has no meaning. You're not required to do that. You can, but you're not required to do that. So if there's no restriction on it, there's nothing you can do, in my opinion. But you can amend to include that restriction if you choose. You just got to follow the process.
Yeah, I think your Latin word was something like grandus fatheris. Not a Latin
something
word.
like that. Yeah.
In North Carolina, how much freedom does a board have on refining rules and regulations that are unclear in the CC&Rs? So I think this would be if the rules are adopted as an exhibit in the CC&Rs and recorded.
Yeah, so I'll use a prime example there of parking. What I want to see in restrictions is the board having the ability to adopt rules and regulations regarding specific issues, whether it's parking, whether it's, you know, I don't know, commercial vehicles, whether it's something like that. If there is a broad, if the restrictions say parking is governed by rules and regulations of the board, then you have carte blanche pretty much, as long as the rule is not unreasonable, to adopt whatever rule you want and enforce it. Now, it's rarely that clear. What I see as a specific townhome community that that I no longer represent, but used to, that had specifically in their use restrictions, the very first use restriction was that indicated that the board has the ability to adopt rules and regulations governing lots. Very general, broad statement. And I was fought on that a few times by owners, and they backed down because I pointed to that. That gives the association broad power. So the only limit I would say on this is, as long as you're not being more restrictive than the restriction itself, your rules are probably fine. Now, I can't give you an example of that unless you want to give me one, and then I can talk about it. But I'll go back to what I said before. If your restrictions say the board can adopt rules and regulations regarding parking in the community, and then the restrictions also say no parking on the street between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., I take that to mean that the board cannot make a rule that says you can't park between 5 p.m. and 5 a.m. That changes the restriction, and that rule, in my opinion, would be unenforceable. So you can't change the restriction, and you can't be more restrictive than the restriction. In that framework, I think you're fine. You can do what you want.
Okay. When you say passage of time, the board can take action, are you referring to statute of limitations, latches, or both?
So the passage of time, the statute of limitation is a set statutory legal standard. For example, in North Carolina and South Carolina, if you are damaged by somebody's negligence, you must sue them within 3 years. That is a statutory time frame, period. Latches is mushy. Latches is if I drive by something every day, if I see you go out and start to build a fence, I know you didn't get approval for it. I drive by today and you're digging the ground. I drive by you tomorrow, you've dug another in the ground, put the posts in. I drive by another day, you start to put the stuff up, and I say nothing to you. That fence goes up, and it's been up a year. And now I go to my board member and said, he put that fence up. He didn't get approval. He's in violation. That is a latches argument. Is 1 year enough? I don't know. I'm just giving you an example. It doesn't have to be as long as the statute of limitations for you to be precluded. It really from bringing an enforcement action. It really depends upon the facts surrounding what the violation is. I'll give you an example would be, I have the last house in my community on a corner, and I've got a basketball hoop in my backyard. You're not allowed to have basketball hoops in the community. I didn't ask permission. It's surrounded by trees and nobody sees it. Neighbor builds 3 years later after I put it up. The neighbor builds next to me and sees it. It builds a house there, wasn't there before, and they see it and they report it to the board. That's probably reasonable. That's probably okay for the board then to take action because no one saw it. No one knew about it. Nobody drove by it and saw it every day. The board is not tasked with the responsibility of going upon somebody's backyard and finding a problem. But if it's, and on the same time, I put that basketball hoop up where it is, and my neighbor comes over and sees it the day after I put it up and reports it to the board, and the board does nothing for a year, you may be precluded by latches. I don't know. It's a case-by-case thing, but that's an example of what we're talking about.
So you referenced prior boards not being able to, or in future boards not being able to enforce what prior boards did. We're in a declarant board situation where it just turned over. In this situation, does the new board have the ability to enforce inactivity from a prior declarant board?
So that's another interesting question. The answer to that is, it depends. Most likely, here's what I recommend in that. And I recommend this even with non-declarant boards. Boards went a long time without enforcing something. A new board comes in and people want something enforced. What do you do? So I've advocated for this in the past, that the board send out a communication to all the members that says, look, this issue has not been enforced in the past. However, it is a restriction. We are required to take action. We don't know why prior boards didn't take action, but we, as of a certain date in the future, 60, 90, 120 days, depending upon what the issue is, we are going to start taking enforcement action. I think if you lay that groundwork, that's the best you can do. You're giving people notice of the issue. You're giving people an opportunity to understand what happened in the past, and 3, an opportunity to understand what you're going to do at a future date. And you're giving them time to bring the property or their actions into compliance. That does not a guarantee that if you go to enforce it, you won't be challenged and lose. But what it does is it shows you've acted reasonably to try to get enforcement on an issue that should have been enforced in the past and wasn't. That's the best you can do. Notify the community. We're going to start enforcing this as of this date. And, you know, that might be a situation where you have to be bold. And if it's that important, you may have to die on that hill and see if you win. There's no case law on that. There's ample case law on waiver, on latches, but there's no case law out there that says using that method that I just described is unreasonable. And I think if you're going to enforce something like that, your best shot is to put everybody on notice. In the future, we're going to do it and see how it plays out. It really depends on how important it is to you.
So South Carolina community, we'd like to enforce violations of our board approved guidelines. I missed what you said in the beginning, but can you comment on the ability to enforce board approved guidelines?
Well, a guideline, unless it's an architectural guideline, a guideline is a suggestion. Okay. So if you're talking about board approved rules, if your restrictions allow the association board to adopt rules and regulations, then you may do so under South Carolina law. Prior to the vote by the board approving those rules, and I'm going to call them rules, the proposed rules must be published to the membership, either on the website, email blast, mail, and this is a funny one, you can post it in the common area, at least, I think it's 48 hours before the meeting. The idea there is you're giving members an opportunity, if they choose to look at the rules and then come to the meeting and be heard about. It doesn't say they get to vote on them. It just means they get to talk about them to the board if they want. Then the board can pass them. Once they're passed, you need to record them. It means that you got to take them down to the register of deeds and have them recorded. Once they're recorded, they're enforceable. I would argue that they're enforceable even if they're not recorded until January 10th of the following year. That's the date they must be recorded. So if you adopt something on January 11th of 2022, you can enforce it, in my opinion, that whole year until January 10th of 2023. But if you don't record it by then it's unenforceable. It's really weird the way they wrote it. I think it's unclear. I don't think that's necessarily intent, but that's the legislature for you, and it's South Carolina. So anyway.
Well, that segues into the next question. Does the requirement to record amendments only apply to South Carolina and is not applicable in North Carolina?
If you're talking about amendment to restrictions, you must absolutely record amendments to restrictions in both states for them to be enforceable, period. If it's not recorded, it's not enforceable. Rules and regulations in North Carolina do not need to be recorded unless the declaration requires it. If the CCR is required to be any rule change to be recorded, you must do it. Some restrictions in North Carolina that I've read require members to vote on rule changes before they can be adopted, but they don't necessarily require them to be recorded. In South Carolina, doesn't matter what it is, bylaw changes, rules and regulation changes, restriction changes, you must record them all.
Okay, I'm going to do 3 more. So I'm sorry I'm not able to get through everybody's questions, but I'm going to hold it to 3. So we kind of talked about this before, but I would like to know if members of the community can basically tell on a neighbor and enforce the violation. So an example, fences are falling apart. From the front, it's okay, but the sides falling apart into someone else's yard. If the neighbor complains, sends photos, can the board act on the information that's shared by the neighbor?
Assuming that a falling down fence is a violation of some restriction or rule, yes. That would, as a matter of fact, if you're going to take pictures of that and send it to the board, it's the best evidence they have to take action. Yes.
Okay.
The board does not have to see it if an owner reports it.
If the CC&Rs refer to the community handbook, yet the developer did not provide the handbook or the document, can the HOA develop the document and include both clarifications and new restrictions that are ARC related type items?
Okay, unless the restrictions required the developer to adopt the handbook, I would say that the board certainly can adopt the handbook. In that handbook, you can put in your architectural guidelines. Certainly that's fine. However, you may not put new restrictions in a handbook and try to enforce them. The new restrictions have to be through the proper amendment process. I don't know if that's the question or not.
Well, I'll ask kind of a question around this question. Your opinion on enforcing non-architectural issues through architectural guideline documents or architectural rule documents. For example, the grass must be of a certain height. Is that an architectural restriction?
No, that's not architectural. Yeah.
So yeah, that would be one of the things that we see commonly in architectural guidelines or restrictions.
Yeah, that could be a landscape guideline. It actually can be if it's your grass can be no more than 4 inches in height. That's not a guideline, that's a rule. A guideline is a suggestion. Okay, a rule is it's set in stone. This is the way it has to be, period. I'd never recommend putting rules in your architectural guidelines. You keep them separate. Architectural guidelines are for exterior improvements, landscaping changes, etc. Okay, that's what that's for. We're going to pre-approve fences of this type and color. That's what the guidelines are. Okay, rules and regulations are different. Rules and regulations are thou shalt not, whatever it is. Thou shalt not have grass more than 4 inches in height. That's a rule. What's the distinction? The distinction is an architectural guideline being a suggestion. You may not comply with the guidelines and still get architectural approval. That's possible, depending upon how your documents are written. On the other hand, the rule and regulation is if I have grass that's 5 inches in height and the rule is 4, I'm in violation. The board has to take action. That's the distinction.
Okay, and I said last question.
Okay.
What is the statute of limitations for most violations? For most violations, can resolutions be successfully used to clarify? Oh, he's got a lot of questions. So, what is the statute of limitations for most violations?
All right. So, technically speaking, if you're talking about the enforcement of a restriction in North Carolina, declarations of covenants, conditions, and restrictions are called incorporeal hereditaments. There'll be a quiz on that tomorrow. Hope you all remember that term. Incorporeal hereditaments. The statute of limitations to enforce something in an incorporeal hereditament, I can't even say it right, is 6 years. There is actually an argument that it's never been addressed in covenants. Covenants that are under seal are like contracts under seal, and the statute of limitation would be 10 years. I don't subscribe to that. I think the specific language means it's 6. In North Carolina, in South Carolina, I don't remember. I think it's 8 years, but I would have to check that. But that has nothing to do with the waiver or latches argument. Waiver and latches, as I've described before, is what we call equitable arguments, and it comes down to really what's fair. If I'm driving by the violation every day for a year and you've spent money to put your fence up and you painted it since you put it up and all this, that's going to be harder to, even though it's inside the statute when we bring action, that could be tough to enforce. I'm not saying you won't win it. I'm just saying it could be tough.
Okay. So I'd say I kind of lied, but this is all part of this last question.
That's fine.
2, can resolutions be successfully used to clarify covenants?
Resolution is simply a rule, another name for a rule. And so if you have rulemaking authority, yes. the issue is what I don't like to see, and what I think is not enforceable, is if your restrictions have a specific definition that may be less than clear and the board adopts a resolution to clarify that, I believe you're becoming more restrictive at that point than what the restriction has in there. If you want to clarify a restriction, you don't do it via resolution, you do it via amendment.
Okay, and the last of the three of these in this one question, I heard that board code of conduct is not enforceable to remove a board member. Is that the case?
Unless it is something required to be signed in the bylaws, that's true. And if you recall what I said about the board code of conduct, I said you could have them sign at the beginning. If it's not in your bylaws, you could have them sign it as they come into office with the agreement that they will resign, not that they'll be removed. And if they don't resign, then you would have to call a special meeting and have the members removed.
Okay. Always a fun challenge with that last one.
We could go for 3-4 hours on these topics. I mean, it's,
yes.
So I know I could, but I like to talk. So.
Well, everybody, we do thank you for attending. I'm sorry we were not able to get through all of the questions. There are several others. We may try and see if Chris can answer a few of these questions and send them back over. But
sure.
So anyway, we do hold these meetings the third Thursday of every month. I will say next month we do not have one scheduled, so we will resume our board webinars in January, and we do like to generally do a board 101 kind of new board member session at the beginning part of the year. So as new board members come on, please encourage them to participate and be active in our webinar series. So thank you again for attending today. And Chris, thank you. And
sure. Thanks everybody.
Time. Thank you.
Thanks for playing along. We'll see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.